So when you're using a traditional computer system, what happens is you as a user will interact with the user interface on the computer system, and you might ask the computer system to display the files that are currently available on the USB drive that you've plugged in. And so what the user interface does is it interacts with the operating system, and the operating system communicates with hardware. Details of the files on the pen drive are sent back, and then the operating system represents that through the user interface, and you see what files are available to you. But sometimes you want to access functionality which is not available using the current operating system you have installed in your computer, or cannot be represented using the hardware of that current computer. So an example of this would be if you were using a Windows machine but you wanted to run Mac OS. One of the ways of doing this is to use a virtual machine, and I'm just going to show you how this is structured. So how does a virtual machine work? Well, if we take the example of running a Mac OS within a Windows computer, and we want to run iMovie on Mac OS and have it interact with the Windows hardware. We use iMovie, and that communicates with the user interface, which is in the virtualized operating system, in this case Mac OS. And the virtual machine's operating system communicates with its own kernel. Now this kernel is able to interact with the real hardware on the Windows machine. And even if it's something like just displaying a change to the order of the videos in iMovie, or whether it is being able to access the part of the Windows hard drive or Windows file storage, then the virtual machine kernel for the Mac OS will be able to do that. So just to recap, iMovie communicates with the Mac OS user interface in the virtual machine. That Mac OS virtual machine has its own kernel, okay, and the Mac OS kernel, which is inside the virtual machine, has the ability to communicate outside of the virtual machine with the real hardware. There are, of course, advantages and disadvantages of virtual machines. Obviously, one of the major advantages is that you can have multiple operating systems on the same machine. And this is a great idea if, for example, you're a bank and you're using a legacy system. So there's a reference, you might have heard of this, to the Millennium Bug, and this was an error that was spotted around in the early 90s, where bank systems especially had been created in the 1960s for mainframes, and they only used 2 digits for the year instead of 4. And so to save space, the programmers at the time had just used the last 2 digits of the year. So instead of 1972, it was just 72. Now the problem with this was that because the year only relied on 2 digits, when it came to changing from 99 to 2000, 1999 to 2000, what happened was, or what they estimated would happen was, the banking system would crash, because suddenly accounts would, the owners of accounts would be negative ages, for example, or the transactions would appear to be prior to the transactions that happened in that bank account, say in 1999. The ones in 2000 would be at 00, so they would essentially be the first bank transactions in the bank account. So all these potential errors were exposed. So obviously computer systems have moved on, and the systems in the 1960s that were installed in banks have been superseded many times. And so to save upgrading what had been expensive hardware, software, or hard to replace hardware, virtual machines are a much more cost-effective way of accessing old software programs that are maybe no longer supported. There are drawbacks, however. Obviously, if you're running virtual machine on a computer system, then that's going to slow down the overall performance. It doesn't always give you an exact experience as if you were using a real machine with its particular hardware. In addition to this, it does take a lot of time and effort to set up a virtual machine, and sometimes the time and effort involved in setting up a virtual machine outweighs the benefits that would bring.